Hi everyone, Ness here. Today we're going to be reviewing Bad Apple Wars on the PlayStation Vita. So Bad Apple Wars is an otome game that was released in 2017 in North America, and it's one of the few, I believe, otome titles that's still a Vita exclusive. So there's no PlayStation 4, PC, or Switch port, at least not yet, which is kind of surprising to me because I think the vast majority of at least the otome games that have been localized by Axis Games have been ported to a more, should we say, viable system than just the Vita, but that's not the case for Bad Apple Wars. So if you want to play it, you'll have to get a Vita or a PlayStation TV or play it via some other means. So Bad Apple Wars takes place in a unique version of the afterlife that's set up like a school. The game literally starts with the protagonist, whose default name is Rinka, so we'll call her that throughout this review, but you can change her name if you want to. It starts with her getting hit by a car on her way to her first day of high school, which honestly sucks. I mean, it was like she was crossing the street when the street light said walk, but then she lost her shoe, and as she was fiddling with it and trying to put it back on, she got hit by a truck, which is a terrible way to go. After she died, Rinka was transported to a school and greeted by a man wearing a rabbit head, and this rabbit man, uncreatively referred to as Mr. Rabbit, and the atmosphere of the entire school is very unsettling. I was kind of shocked by how almost horror-esque the game seemed from the get-go. Like, if the purpose of these early scenes was to instill a sense of dread, mission accomplished on that point. Wasn't really sustained, but it started out strong. So the school that Rinka's attending is called Neva Academy. There's two groups of students at the academy, and they're referred to as the Good Apples and the Bad Apples. The Good Apples are students who do as they're told and follow all of the extremely numerous rules of the academy. Good Apples will eventually graduate, but in doing so, they lose their sense of self and their individuality in the process. The Bad Apples, on the other hand, make it their sole purpose to break as many rules as possible in hopes of attaining the forbidden apple and getting expelled from the school rather than graduating. Graduating is basically reincarnation into a different person, and the game describes it as you get reincarnated and you experience the despair of human life time and time again, while getting expelled basically means that you get to come back to life with all of your memories and your sense of self still intact. In charge of making sure that the rules are followed, there are teachers, but they're not really responsible for discipline, and I really don't even know what they teach either, but they're not responsible for discipline. There's a group of, I guess, super good apples who are basically like hall monitors on steroids who are responsible for making sure that the rules are followed, and they do this by correcting students who fall out of line, and they do that by hitting them with like a yardstick. But it's a little bit more than just getting hit by a yardstick. When you get hit by the yardstick, it causes like people to temporarily fall into I feel like I'm using the word despair a lot, and I don't want this to sound like I'm talking about Danganronpa with all this despair, but it basically makes the person fall into despair. They get down on themselves, but within a couple moments they go back to normal. So that's an important group to discuss here out of the get-go. In addition to the insane amount of rules that the academy has, there are also limits. So limits are what prohibit students from breaking what are called unbreakable rules, which is kind of a weird phrase when I think about it, because it doesn't sound like you would have to keep someone from breaking something that's unbreakable, but okay. Some limits are universal, such as the limit that prevents people from telling others that they love them. So if you were to try to tell someone that you love them, your voice would be blocked out by like static. If you were to try and write it down or draw it out some kind of way or make any kind of visual representation of love, the image would be blurred out so nobody could see it. Other limits are a bit more tailored to individuals, preventing them from doing something that would result in them breaking the rules. So like if you were a singer and that's how you portray your emotions is through songs, you would probably have a limit that would keep you from singing anything too heartfelt. However, somebody who isn't as passionate about singing would probably be able to sing with no issues, but it also wouldn't have that same impact. There's also an interesting mechanic called soul touch. So soul touch is the phenomenon that occurs whenever two people make physical contact with each other at the academy. So during soul touch, you'll be able to see a person's memories from when they were alive. Apparently it doesn't happen all the time for most people, but Rinka is particularly susceptible to experiencing soul touch. So she sees people's memories anytime she makes physical contact with someone. These are pretty intimate experiences, so most people try to avoid touching others, unless they end up seeing something that the other person didn't want to share. Bad Apple Wars is also unique in that it doesn't have choices like most otome games or visual novels for that matter. Instead of choices, soul touch is what determines what ending you'll get. So during the soul touch scenes, you use the touch screen on the Vita, and you can also use the if you're playing on a PlayStation TV, you'd use the touch pad on like a DualShock 4 controller. You'd use that in order to touch the characters. Most characters have places where they don't want you touching, and if you do that over and over again, that's how you would trigger a bad ending. That'd be like making the bad choices, and if you touch them in the right places, you'll get a good ending.
That's what she said.
So for this next segment of the video, we're going to go into the individual routes. I'm going to try and keep my thoughts on each route relatively spoiler free, but I'm not making any promises, so if you want to be safe, I'll put a timestamp on the screen where you can skip to if you don't want any spoilers. But I do believe that I did a pretty good job taking out anything that would really be considered a spoiler in these. So Alma's route. Alma is the stoic leader of the Bad Apples, the backbone of the entire group, and everyone, literally everyone in the Bad Apples takes his word as seriously as law. Like if Alma says it, it is what it is. You don't ask any questions, you do it. And I guess they do this since Alma's been at the academy the longest. I just thought it was a little weird how eager everyone was to do anything he said, and like Alma's a decent guy, so it's not like he was abusing their trust or anything, but that's kind of a lot of responsibility for one person. But just how much the others rely on him to really do anything is painfully obvious, especially in the bad endings. Personality wise, he's pretty serious, and while he doesn't seem like he feels much in the way of emotions, he's quite the opposite. I enjoyed Alma's route, and I wish I'd done it first. Since Alma is the leader of the Bad Apples, there isn't really anyone he can lean on in his moments of weakness, and Rinka becomes that person for him. And she's quite courageous and outspoken when it comes to doing what's best for Alma. There also seemed to be less of this, Rinka had a tendency in most of the other routes to talk about how she's so empty and she feels so helpless because she's so empty and she's so empty and she's so empty. She really kept on with that in so many of the in so many of the other routes, but in this one it was less. But then again, this wasn't the first route that I played, so I was able to skip through most of the common route, so that may be why I feel like it was less, but I do think it was less of that. Higa. I don't really know how to describe Higa. I guess you could say he's got like a rough exterior, but he's actually a pretty caring guy. At first glance, I was expecting him to be kind of a tsundere, given how mean he is at first. But really, Higa's not mean. He just has a scary, I guess. I didn't think his face was scary, but Rinka did. He just has a scary face and a rough way of talking that can make him seem like he's meaner than he actually is. Higa is a baseball player, and he has a strong loyalty toward Alma, whom he refers almost exclusively to as Aniki, or like bro in English. And Higa's also kind of shameless, I guess you could say, or I guess maybe blunt is a better word. Like I don't think Higa really feels things like embarrassment. I do have to say that Higa's route felt kind of empty. You know, Rinka talks about how empty she is all the time, but this route was what was truly empty. It was mildly enjoyable, but at the end of it, I just was kind of like, okay, but what was the point of literally anything that happened in this route? You know, compared to the other routes, this one just was not as deep or meaningful. Shikishima is what could be described as, I would say, chaotic neutral. He's not a bad apple, but he's not a good apple either. The prefects call him an odd apple, and they seem to leave him alone. From what I was able to gather, they don't correct him when he breaks the rules either. He just apologizes and they let him go. While Shikishima doesn't make it a point to deliberately break rules, if he wants to do something but it just happens to be against the rules, he'll still do it. He's an artist from the Taisho period, which was like in the early 1900s, and can often, almost always, be found painting in his sketchbook. Shikishima comes across as if he's just fine with anything. The academy is fine. The fact that all of his drawings and paintings are completely black and nobody can tell what they are is fine. He says it's because he believes everything in the world is beautiful, even if it's cruel. Saying that in and of itself could be interpreted as beautiful, I guess, but it's also kind of lonely. Though Shikishima is always smiling kindly at Rinka, he also feels so distant. You can essentially think of Shikishima as like the human embodiment of that "this is fine" meme with the dog sitting in like a room engulfed in flames. So Shikishima's route made me feel so much, and I'm feeling so much just talking about it again. I felt so sorry for him that, you know, he lived like his entire life he felt like an outsider, you know. Then he comes to the academy and he's still an outsider, you know, given that he's not a good apple or a bad apple. His situation at the academy is a little bit different, since I do think Shikishima's status as an odd apple was kind of voluntary, since the bad apples do consider him somewhat of an ally, but it's also clear that they think he's kind of weird too, like harmless and nice but weird, which is honestly kind of understandable. I'm assuming Shikishima was able to pick up on that, and that's why he didn't really get too close to them. If I had to describe Shikishima's route in one word, it would be loneliness. And now when I think back on it, Shikishima basically carried his whole route by himself. Like, Rinka could have not been there, and I don't think it would have changed anything. Like, a lot happens to Shikishima in his route, but none of it is reliant on Rinka, and Rinka doesn't really affect anything that happens as a result of it either. I feel like I talked about Shikishima's route the most so far, but I do think Shikishima's route was probably the most like fleshed out and the one that made the most sense until you get to his good ending, which I won't spoil, but his good ending was kind of, it wasn't that great, to be honest. Satoru, you know, I don't know why, but for some reason I was really looking forward to Satoru's route. I'm not into Shota's. He is like 13, but he just struck me as hilarious. The academy can be very unpredictable, but one thing that's always the same is Satoru's devotion to his reference book. Throughout most of the other routes, everything he says comes from, or he tries to make it seem that way at least, from that study book of his. It's even funnier because Satoru actually says these words in English. I didn't mention this before because I think if you play otome games, it's kind of an obvious fact, but the game is in Japanese. Everything's translated into English, but all of the dub is still Japanese. It was not dubbed into English. So when Rinka kept trying to speak to him, he literally told her, like, leave me alone, like in English, and then he starts riddling off like Japanese synonyms to it, and that was honestly great. You don't have to pursue Satoru's route to know that he is obsessed with studying. Rinka assumes it's because he just likes to study, but Satoru doesn't study like somebody who just enjoys studying. He studies like his life depends on it. It's obsessive. Satoru's route was the first one I did on the good apple side, so like the routes are broken up between like the good apples and the bad apples, and so like Alma, Higa, and Shikishima are considered the bad apple side, and then Satoru and White Mask, who we haven't talked about yet, are on the good apple side. And a mild spoiler, and I'm just divulging this because it happens very, very, very early in both of the good apple routes, but in Satoru's route as well, you end up becoming a prefect yourself. So Rinka is a prefect, like, from the start. I was kind of surprised by that. What's disappointing about that though is that it doesn't really make a difference in the story. It's kind of interesting to work alongside White Mask, particularly like as he trains her on how to be a prefect, but you know, early on Rinka strays from her duties and starts hanging out with the bad apples, you know. And what's even more odd about that is that White Mask just doesn't seem to care. Like, I doubt he's completely oblivious, but he never says anything about how she's not doing her job. Even like as the bad apples start breaking the forbidden rules and Rinka starts doing things to literally help the bad apples, he just doesn't address it. But Satoru's a sweet kid. He's literally in 8th grade, but he's endearing in his own way. I didn't really have any like weird feelings about the Shota route because the game doesn't have any kind of like sexual content, or really even, well, I won't say there's no sexual tension between Rinka and anyone. I think maybe Alma's route has the most, but this one doesn't, and I didn't feel weird about it since Rinka's like, I think she's 14, so there's maybe not even a year difference between them, and they were born in the same time period, so no age weirdness going on there. It turns out that Satoru's just a normal kid, you know. He seems extremely socially challenged and like he would be thriving in 2020 / the early part of 2021 with all this social distancing corona stuff going on at the moment. But he actually had a lot of friends before, you know, he started doing nothing but studying. The one critique I guess I have about this route is that it was not particularly romantic, but Satoru's 13, so I don't really know how romantic you would expect a 13-year-old to be. And I felt like Rinka and Satoru's relationship was really cute, and it felt pretty it was just good to see because it seemed so like innocent and genuine, you know. So still touching. So White Mask. While playing through Satoru's route, White Mask started to intrigue me, and he didn't prior to that. Since you're basically assigned to be a prefect in both of the good apple rights, you get some real interaction with White Mask. I won't call him by his real name since I feel like that's a kind of decent spoiler, but he is sort of the leader of the prefects, and I say sort of because it's shown that the prefects function just as well with him as they do without him. And it's not because he's a bad leader, but that's just how they operate, I guess. Rinka notices pretty early on that White Mask is different from the other prefects, while the other prefects seem to simply be punishing the bad apples because that's because they're breaking the rules and that's their job. White Mask seems to take it personally. He's often relentless in his pursuit of the bad apples, and he's the only one of them to actually look and sound obviously angry at them when he is punishing them for disobeying the rules. The most notable thing about White Mask's route is how highly likely it is that you'll probably get a bad ending the first time you do it. In all the other routes, you have to be trying to get a bad ending just because of the nature of the soul touch mechanic. White Mask is very particular about where he likes to be touched. While White Mask's route is pretty interesting and Shinosuke Tachibana's performance, especially, there's a part where like White Mask, oh my god, I'm not gonna say it, but we all know he's a good voice actor if you're familiar with him. But overall, the route was just a little disappointing. It's kind of slow, and then everything just suddenly like picks up and then it's over. Like the pacing was all over the place. Also, this route had one of the worst cases of insta-love that I think I have ever seen. It was out of nowhere. There was no hint. There was absolutely no build up to it whatsoever. It was almost as if White Mask just like switched personalities on us. It was just out of nowhere. It was kind of like they were writing it and then they were like, oh shit, there has to be some kind of romance, make him fall in love with her because he has to. So that was probably the weakest point of White Mask's route. So in this next section, that I like to call the breakdown, I'm gonna go through everything I liked in Bad Apple Wars versus everything that I didn't like. So what I liked the overall concept, like with Neva Academy. That sounds kind of vague, but I don't know how else to put it. I can't say I'm a huge fan on how the concept was executed in all instances, but the concept itself was intriguing and a very gripping start. This was the first otome game I played in a long time, maybe even ever, that actually kind of hooked me from the beginning. Usually they just seem to kind of drag to me. I also liked most of the characters. All the characters in Bad Apple Wars were pretty enjoyable, even the ones that didn't get sprites. They were fully voiced and had pretty distinct personalities, the characters without the sprites, but I guess they didn't deserve faces. Also, Shigashima's route. That is all. I also like the differences in the memories that Rinka sees based on where she touches people during the soul touch scenes. Generally, the memories are the same, but if you're on a path of like the true or good ending, the memories will have a more hopeful feel to them, while if she's on the path of the bad endings, they tend to feel more despairing. It was fitting and a nice touch. I also liked the user interface. I usually don't talk about user interface in Ultimate games since they kind of all operate the same, but Bad Apple Wars has some like slick menus. Like presentation overall was impressive and very stylish. What I didn't like: the soul touch scenes that happen during the routes. Like when they are like during the soul touch scene, you'll get like a CG where the characters are like holding each other and they're naked, not like sexual, but just like ultimate vulnerability. Those scenes are not translated. There's no subtitles during those scenes. I know enough Japanese that I was able to understand what was being said in most of these scenes, but just to not translate them at all during these intimate scenes that are supposed to display like a lot of vulnerability between the characters was just kind of unacceptable, to be honest. I'm guessing they didn't do it because there were no like text boxes to put the translated text inside of. Like as far as even like there is no place to put text, so I'm guessing even in the Japanese they didn't sub that portion. And I guess like in Japan most people, they understand what's being spoken, so they don't need the words on there, but if you were hard of hearing, I still feel like you should put them in there. But yeah, really just kind of an odd choice not to translate part of a game. I also didn't like that there were so many things that were mentioned and then never explained. So it makes me wonder why they were even mentioned in the first place. It was almost like the writers knew certain things didn't make sense, but they didn't want to explain why, so they didn't. And it's like, well, why even mention it at all? Like, the age differences between the characters. So like, everybody at the academy is around the same age, but a lot of them were born during different times. So like, I think I mentioned that Shikishima was born in the early 1900s, and then you have Rinka, who's born like during this time. She's like 14, so she's born probably like in the early 2000s. And then there's Alma, who seems like he was born maybe in the 70s or the 80s, and then there's Higa, who was like born I think maybe in the 50s, and I don't really get the point of that. Like, I don't get why time is all like wonky at the academy, and does it even matter? And I guess it doesn't, because we don't get an explanation other than time is weird here, but we don't worry about it, because even if we had theories, we'd have no way to confirm them. That's literally the explanation that you get from Alma, and then like the whole time inconsistency thing is never brought up again. Like, I don't understand the point in everybody being from these different eras, and yet they all have to come together at the academy. I was also kind of confused about the teachers. It's not that I didn't like them, I just wish they had a point. They don't really do anything. Buckethead, which sounds funny when I say that like that, but that's literally his name, Buckethead. He speaks the most, which would make him seem like he's somewhat important, since he reveals a little bit about why there are rules in the first place at the academy, but it's just like 2 sentences that touch on it, and that's it. The rabbit guy is weird and taunting, but besides like making you uncomfortable in the beginning, like, why is he there? Also, Gas Mask is creepy, but he's creepy in all the ways you'd expect him to be, and I still don't get why he was doing like these experiments and making some crazy machine. I don't really get why he was doing any of that other than like to be creepy, but what is the point? I don't think there was one. I also couldn't stand the common route. This isn't so much of an issue once you complete at least one route, because then you can skip it. But the common route is so long. It's like 6 chapters, and there are small asides in each chapter where you'll get to spend time with like whichever guy's route you're on, but they're pretty short, and then you're right back on the common route. Honestly, I think the common route should be called Sanzu's route, and she was I'd say she was a side character, but she was kind of important in her own way. But I just, and there's a school festival, and when you get to the school festival, it becomes pretty clear like why they wanted you to spend so much time with Sanzu, but it felt like the writers were trying to make you care about her. Like, it was not genuine, and if they didn't make you care, then it just fell flat. And to me, she just seemed pretty bland, just no matter how much she spoke. And then she had this argument with one of her bandmates, because she was in a band with this other guy in the Bad Apples, and they both like died together, and they had a whole argument, and I didn't care, and it was so long, and it was presented like this huge thing. I'm like, this doesn't involve Rinka, this doesn't involve any of the guys, like, who cares? I don't understand. And like, their circumstances were unfortunate, but so were literally everyone else's at the academy. Honestly, I would have rather spent all that time with Inishi. You really only get a glimpse of what happened to his death in one of the routes, or what happened during his death in one of the routes, and I would have rather that have been elaborated on than sit here and watch this argument between like 14-year-olds. I also didn't like Higa's route. I played his route first because I like Suwabe Jinichi's voice, but that route was definitely the most boring of all of them. I like Higa as a character, and honestly, he was more entertaining in other routes than he was in his own sometimes. Rinka's just lack of development may have been what was most at fault for this, though. She spends the entire time being afraid of Higa's face. I wish I was exaggerating, but I'm not. And talking about how empty she is. You know, in other routes, even though it takes a long time, she develops some kind of conviction. In his, she doesn't. So Higa has to carry like the whole route on his own, and the only thing Higa really has going for him is that he likes baseball. I also didn't like Soul Touch. I mean, it wasn't terrible, but I didn't see the point in poking the screen in different spots just to get text boxes to come up in advance through text, just like you do in the rest of the game. Like, the whole, characters get naked thing was fine, not sexual, but I still don't know why I had to poke the screen over and over in certain spots. Like, I realize that's what we got instead of choices, but I just feel like they could have made that feel somewhat more meaningful somehow. I also wasn't a fan of how there were no choices. Are choices necessary for a good ultimate game or visual novel? I don't think so, and honestly, I think I'd prefer no choices over having choices that don't really affect the story whatsoever and they're just there to be there. But I do think that they help games feel more interactive. Visual novels are just that. They are visual novels. They don't require a lot of input from the player, but I feel like choices kind of help offset that. And there were multiple instances where I was thinking to myself, this would be a good place to give us a choice. But no, our choice is where we want to touch the guys, but not really, because they only respond if you touch in certain places. I also didn't like what I'm going to call main character immunity. I'm not sure if that's like an actual literary term, but I'm going with it. Nothing bad really ever happens to anyone who matters in a given route. Instead, they happen to lesser characters, the ones that don't have a face, like a side character named Huma, who honestly is fully voiced and kind of goes through a lot to where I think he deserved to have a face. But regardless, my issue with that is that after a few routes of the same anticlimactic resolutions, any suspense that the game tries to introduce, it just falls flat, because nothing bad is ever going to happen to any of the important characters, because you get the same kind of buildups over and over again, and they all kind of resolve themselves the same way. And by anything bad happening, I'm not even talking about something as serious as somebody dying. I think the only person who ever gets corrected, aka hit with a ruler by the prefects, is Higa during his route, and Satoru too, but Satoru gets corrected so much and he goes right back to studying that it's like a gag in all the other routes. There was also so much tea, and not the dramatic kind. I swear, anytime more than 2 bad apples are in that little meeting room that they would gather in, there had to be a whole conversation about making tea, and then everyone has to chime in to say which tea they want, and then Sanzu goes and makes it. She brings it back, and everyone has to thank her individually, one by one, and they do this every single time. Like, they could have demonstrated that one time, and that would have been more than enough. As with the common route, after the first time you go through it, you can skip most of that, but the bad apples have so much mundane conversation between one another that it's ridiculous. Like, it causes things to drag, and it never involves the person whose route you're on either, so it's like, why do I care? I'm not saying that every conversation that every character has to have like groundbreaking meaning, but if they don't really have any kind of meaning, they shouldn't drag on for just lines and lines and lines and lines. And I think the intention was to try and show you the rapport between the bad apples, but that tea conversation, that mundane conversation is what made me not care for Nanaka either. Like, he's okay, but anytime I saw his face, I knew he was about to speak paragraphs of lines that add nothing to the conversation whatsoever, and they were also translated so oddly. Like, Nanaka doesn't really speak Japanese in any kind of way that's stands out, aside from the fact that he refers to himself in third person, which they didn't keep in his translated lines. Instead, he speaks in like cringy internet speak, I guess you could call it. He says things like totes adorbs or other nonsense. Like, I don't understand that translation or localization decision. That was a bit of a tangent, but moving on. While I liked it, I also didn't like the user interface, but a different aspect of it. It looked nice and it was pleasant to use, but I don't understand why there are so many choices throughout the game on where you want to go around the academy. You know, given that during the common route, wherever you go kind of early on determines whose route you're gonna start, but after that, I don't get the point in letting us choose where we want to go. Like, after your route is established, it doesn't matter what order you go to the different locations in. But even worse than that is, why present us with a menu when there's literally one option in the menu? Like, there is no choice because there's only one thing that you can do, and then the menu still asks if you're sure you want to go there, as if it's gonna make a difference anyway. It was just a small gripe, but it happened so often that it became a nuisance. I'm also mad that Inishi didn't have a route. I don't understand why he even had a character design, since, you know, I would argue there were some bad apples who for whatever reason weren't worthy of character designs, but they spoke more and contributed more than Enishi did in like 98% of the routes. You know, through Shikishima's route, you catch a glimpse of what happened to Enishi before he died, which is what sparked my interest in him, though honestly I like the way he looked too. But in most of the other routes, nothing would be any different if he just was not there. Rinka doesn't get close to him either, not like she does with like Naraka or Yo or Sanzu, so I don't understand why they had to tease me with the fact that, you know, I have to see Inishi, but I can't date him. So the next section is going to be broken up into different categories, and I've rated them with numbers, but don't put too much stock in those numbers. These are really just things that I think are worth talking about. So the graphics, I give the graphics an 8 out of 10. The art style was unique, I'll say, and it took me some getting used to, but you know, after spending so much time looking at it, it's grown on me, and I do like it. I will say that Higa's abs are confusing to me because they seem like they take up his entire torso. Controls, a 9 out of 10. One point I docked for Soul Touch. I was not a fan of how not only did you have to touch certain random parts of the characters, but you also had to do it in like a kind of arbitrary order. This was made even more cumbersome due to the fact that I played this on a PlayStation TV rather than like an actual Vita, so, you know, moving the analog stick all around and like randomly pressing the X button got annoying. It was less annoying than trying to use that little tiny touchpad though, so that's why I did that. And I think that was more annoying than if you were just like tapping the screen over and over. Gameplay, I gave an 8 out of 10. It's a visual novel, so there's not like any traditional gameplay. However, I docked points for the Soul Touch system. I didn't like it overall. I think I've said that numerous times at this point. But I docked it in the control section based on the way the system was actually implemented, not the system itself. And the fact that I wasn't able to skip some of the text using the only viewed feature, even though I had viewed it before. There's certain dialogue that even though you've seen it and it does not change between the routes, I guess the game doesn't recognize it as red text. It's a small thing, but you know, there was like conversation between the teachers when you managed to break all of the rules that comes to mind that was not skippable, even though it was the same. And after reading through them like 5 times, I can assure you there was absolutely no difference in those lines. So the music, I give an 8 out of 10. The music was pretty good. None of the general background music really stood out to me that much, but during like tense moments, the music changes definitely added to the tense atmosphere. Also, there's a song that Sanzu sings during the school festival, and it also plays during the credits. That song is amazing. So the story, 7 out of 10. This review probably makes it sound like I didn't like this game, but that's not the case. Personally, I just saw some missed opportunities to really make the story more interesting and a few mundane conversations that could have been omitted entirely. Given that the common route is so long, I think more effort to make it tolerable, even if you only play through it once, would have went a long way. The start of the game is really interesting and grabs your attention, but once you get to the Bad Apple's hideout, the story stalls. It almost comes to a halt. The pacing went from like we were driving smooth and fast on the highway, and then just like boom, suddenly you're crawling in bumper to bumper traffic. Overall, I'd give the game an 8 out of 10, and I'd recommend it. I saw some reviews about it before I actually played it that were honestly pretty harsh, but I think as far as otome games that have been localized on like, I'll say official consoles, I'm not including anything like on mobile, this is not the worst by any stretch. I think that may go to Period Cube. Is it the best one ever? No, but with the exception of Higa's route, and I love Higa, I swear, just his route was painful. It was an enjoyable ride. So that's it for my review of Bad Apple Wars. Let me know what you thought about it. Let me know if you have any suggestions about, different things you think I could include, or just, feedback on ways to improve. Let me know also if you played this game and you liked it, or if you didn't like it, or ask me why I'm doing a review for a game that's almost 4 years old, whatever. But leave a comment, like, and subscribe, and I will see y'all in the next one. All right, thank you, bye.